Get ready for a reframing of the 10 plagues that hit Egypt.
Yeah, and the ancient Passover tradition, some symbolism there, and how our sacrament ordinance each week can really connect us with harnessing to the power of Christ. All that this week on Real Talk, Come Follow Me.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Real Talk, Come Follow Me. Today we get the opportunity to discuss the 10 plagues of Egypt, among other things.
Yeah.
And
it will be happy. We'll figure out a way to keep it real and happy.
We are going to offer a potential reframing of the 10 plagues, and so we hope it's beneficial for you and sort of jump-starting your own study this week of these chapters.
Yeah, Exodus 7 through 13, and we feel like it's a really good pre-general conference coming up conversation to have. That's our intention, is that this is, we hope you'll share it with friends and family as they prepare for general conference, because it feels relevant.
Yeah, it does.
In that way. Well, let's jump.
Let's do it. So in terms of reframing, maybe I'll give a little preface here. When I was in grad school, we all know I was an English major for various strange reasons that, I'm still trying to figure out in my life. But I was asked to write a couple chapters for the freshman English composition textbook. And one of my chapters I had to write was about narratives, personal narratives. So I had to study this genre of narrative, okay? And so I started to see how sort of real life stories translate into writing. And I started to see how it's not always the same, or, depends on the lens that the writer took to that event. So what's written down can sometimes be very different than what actually happened. So with that in mind, here we are reading about the 10 plagues that happened in Egypt 3,500 years ago-ish.
Approximate.
Yeah, approximate. There is a lot, I'm assuming, that has changed in this narrative, right? I remind us of our own article of faith that says we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it's translated correctly. And I just felt that as I went through the 10 plagues this time, like, what details are we missing? What biases have been imposed on the narrative? It's been created into this really cool narrative, classic narrative of the one true God versus the fake Egyptian gods, right? I mean, and there's some merit in that. There's some pretty cool parallels you can draw where each plague kind of diminished an Egyptian god and elevated the real God of Israel, right? So that's kind of cool. But I would like to offer a unique reframing that it's really resonated with me, especially this time through, in terms of the 10 plagues.
Because there's a lot written.
There's so much written.
A lot of research.
And we're going to put some stuff in the show notes for you to access if you're interested in reading some stuff about this. But orienting the 10 plagues within the context of an impending natural disaster or series of natural disasters.
That kind of maybe domino.
Yes, that domino effect, yep. So to start this reframe, I'd like to think about Moses out in the wilderness. He's, herding his sheep and things and just living the good life out of Egypt. And all of a sudden now, just out of nowhere, right? God appears to him. It's time to go back. Why now? Why not the year before? Why not the year after? Why not the month? Why not the week before? Why not the week after? And it's the contention of many that it's because a natural disaster was coming to Egypt. Here are some common ones, and again, we'll put an article from the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine.
Smart people.
Yeah, some people way smarter than we are. Well, I speak for myself, not you, Ganel-Lyn.
Well, no.
And then another fun article from Time Magazine. That's just a couple. There's so many, but I like the theory. So they give three most prominent theories. There was a big volcano somewhere up in the Mediterranean that had erupted that started this sort of this cascade of natural disasters that befell Egypt. Another one is there's a red algae bloom in the Mediterranean Sea making its way down the Nile and things like that. When I was in the Philippines as a missionary, they called that red tide, and it's pretty toxic and terrible. And another one would be just a general change in the climate for some reason or other, some climate change event.
Well, and I'm thinking about how God really does use the patterns of natural law
Right.
And the restoration of the gospel
Right.
kind of was signaled by a volcanic eruption that changed the growing seasons, that moved the Smith family. You know, it doesn't feel too far-fetched to consider that God, in his highest purpose, will use what is maybe naturally occurring and natural laws.
I really, and you know me, and we both believe the same thing about that and God's character. Kind of, if it feels too forced, I kind of bristle against it. But when it feels more organic,
or maybe we're missing some of the transitions in the narrative.
Yeah. So consider this.
Okay.
If you look at the 10 plagues, we'll just briefly go through them.
They're fun things.
Think of
There's some fun plagues.
you're like my friend at work. Everything is fun, even when it's horrible. Everything is awesome, right? It's fun. That's the word. Fun. Oh, that's fun.
Well, it's one way to reframe really hard things like,
it is.
Dead things.
But the beautiful thing about reframing it as a natural disaster that's going to befall Egypt is that it turns God from being someone who's angry with the Egyptians and is going to smite them with a bunch of horrible things to a God who wants to save Egypt, who's sending Moses in to warn them and give them a chance to be prepared or preserved or both.
And that feels consistent with the character of God,
right? Right. Yeah, that's the whole point for me. So here they are. First one, all the water in the land goes bad. Again, for me, I was being drawn more to the volcanic eruption kind of theory when I went through this. And you can all read this and decide what you like. And maybe you don't like it at all, and that's okay too. All the water goes bad. As a result, natural consequence, all the fish die, frogs flee from the water and infest the land. They all die, community-wide infestation, some sort of lice or parasite, number 3. Number 4, an infestation of flies. Here we go, it's just a dominoes.
There's so much fun.
It's so fun. 5, a disease kills the livestock in the land. 6, a disease of boils and blains erupts in the community. 7, a toxic, fiery hail and rainstorm occurs. They're thinking that's volcanic ash and things like that in the atmosphere. 8, swarms of locusts infest the land. 9, thick darkness, covering, again, just sort of this atmospheric stuff from the volcano. And 10, the firstborn child in Egypt dies, and we can kind of mention that in the end. There's lots of different theories about what
there's
that
a lot
might have
built
looked,
into that plague,
There's a lot of instances in Exodus 9, for instance, where it says, for instance, 9, verse 5 and 18, the Lord appointed a set time, saying to Moses, tomorrow go and tell, Pharaoh, go warn him about these things. Why tomorrow? Well, because God sees what's coming.
And he's always merciful.
That's right. He sends his prophet to give a warning so that they can either be prepared and or preserved from that thing. Verse 18, behold, tomorrow about this time, I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, right? Or, paraphrase, about this time tomorrow, it's going to start coming down. Go warn him. And so I love the idea of God warning Pharaoh, and this time through the narrative. For the first time, I don't think I've ever seen this before, but I associated myself, I saw myself as the Pharaoh. And I had never done that before. And I just thought of how many times God warns me, like, things are coming. Change your life in this way, change your life in that way. And it just seems so consistent with his character that here we have some hard-headed, hard-hearted people, especially the Pharaoh. And God says, some horrible things are coming to my children. Moses, go warn them. Another thing's coming tomorrow, Moses, go warn them. In a couple days, go warn them again. He keeps time and time again, chance after chance. And that's consistent with the God I know.
Which I think is perfect with the idea of preparing this week for General Conference.
Yes.
And this is where the Joseph Smith translation is super helpful, because sometimes the Joseph Smith translation clarifies certain things. This actually corrects with additional information that Pharaoh hardened his own heart in Exodus 7, right?
Great
and so I
clarification.
love your vulnerability there in saying, like, how often are we the prodigal son? How often are we the Laman and Lemuel? How often are we Pharaoh? And as we prepare for General Conference, I think it's interesting to consider that we're receiving instruction for those with authority. And if you juxtapose it to the Egyptian gods at the time, Moses was the one called with the authority. And were the people listening to the warnings from these false gods, or were they listening to a prophet that was among them and maybe dismissed because he felt too maybe common or accessible? I don't know. What are the things that are in my heart well, really, is that a warning? Is that a clarion cry for me? Is that a shift that's for me? It brings to mind a conversation I had with a lot of our viewers may have seen Andrei Polonsky, who's living in the Ukraine right now. And I had a chance to interview him on Instagram. And he's the Ukrainian who posted about being so grateful that there's a living prophet that asked him to have food storage. And he is now, receiving a lot of donations and taking food to those that are in bomb shelters. And at the time of this taping, every day you see on Instagram where he is going into bomb shelters and the subways and taking food. And when I had this conversation with him, it was so heart-wrenching, but I thought, how often have we heard certain warnings and it's almost like, oh, not yet. And maybe, like you said, we don't know how long. We don't know duration.
Right.
Like, was there a warning? And then it was so many months later that for some of us, it's like, oh, yeah, they've said we need to do that, but nothing's showing up. I don't see any dead frogs. I don't even know why they're worrying about that. So I wonder as we go.
Maybe we don't see it here, but they're seeing it over there in like Ukraine.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And I think, especially as you have talked about this idea of, are we seeing the authority in our lives so that position we're in to be warned by God, as verse 5 says, that the Lord, when he stretched forth mine hand upon Egypt, and he brought out the children of Israel among them, that God is like, I've got a theme here. I keep trying to like extend my arm. Yeah. And are we missing it? Like, are we missing the invitation to really see where God is warning us? Because it feels too, I don't know, out of touch or common, or I don't know.
Well, and you just made me think of an additional, just one more quick insight there was how God tells Moses, Pharaoh's going to harden his heart, but you're going to warn him anyway. I just think that speaks volumes about the character of God. Knowing Pharaoh's going to harden his heart, he's like, but I am not going to give up on him. And we read how some Egyptians did heed the warnings for certain of these disasters, and they were preserved. And so just a cool thing. And so, why bother reframing?
Right.
I might hear some people ask that. Why bother reframing? Why not just leave the narrative alone? God came and put the smackdown on the Egyptians, and, the rest is history. What came to my mind was this teaching from Joseph Smith, and I love it. I know you liked it too, Ganel-Lyn. Joseph Smith said this, it is necessary for us to have an understanding of God himself in the beginning. If we start right, it's easy to go right all the time, but if we start wrong, we may go wrong, and it may be a hard matter to get right. If men don't comprehend the character of God, they don't comprehend themselves. I want to ask this congregation, every man, woman, and child, to answer the question in their own heart. And here's the question. What kind of being is God? Ask ourselves. Turn your thoughts into your hearts and say if any of you have seen, heard, or communed with him. This is a question that may occupy your attention for a long time. So I again repeat the question. This is still Joseph speaking. What kind of being is God? Does any man or woman know? Have any of you ever seen him, heard him, or communed with him? And then this part, when we understand the character of God and how to come to him, he begins to unfold the heavens to us and to tell us all about it. When we are ready to come to him, he is ready to come to us.
I appreciate that so much because I think so often, right, our hearts aren't softened. And it's easy to see where Pharaoh, like in verse 14, hardened his heart. He refused to let the people go. But I can look at my own soul and say, am I keeping a soft heart in that and turning my thoughts and my heart to God so he can warn me and teach me? Can I add another quote?
Please.
George Q. Cannon.
Love it.
He said, there was scarcely a miracle that Moses wrought that the magicians of the king did not imitate. And every miracle that was wrought only tended to harden the heart of the king and make him determine that he would not let the children of Israel go. So that we see that miracles in and of themselves are no evidence of the divinity of any system, nor of the power and the authority from God of the men who work them. And I think so often we want the miracle, we get the miracle, but we don't acknowledge that it's from God that it's coming from. And so it didn't really matter how much was happening. There were certain people that weren't seeing it. They just weren't seeing it. And I can be that way.
Me too.
Yeah.
So, why bother reframing? I just think it's really important that we are careful about how we cast God and how we portray him. Because if we start wrong, I'm thinking of, I think it was Elder Uchtdorf that gave that beautiful analogy of flying, right? And if you're
And
just
then
1
you're 2
degree
degrees.
off, by the time you get over here, you're way off.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to get it right here at the beginning. And so it's my belief that God took no pleasure in watching the people in Egypt suffer from these plagues. As a matter of fact, I think it's more akin probably to Moses chapter 7 when he looks down and he sees his children rebelling against him and suffering because of their rebellion, and he just weeps. So I don't think God found any pleasure in Pharaoh's suffering, in anyone else's suffering in this whole thing.
And as we were preparing for today, I had some reframing of my own, and mainly it was around the idea of these plagues are happening to everyone, right? And so as you read in Exodus 8, and there are the list of the 10 plagues, right? Is it possible that as we're seeing the dead frogs and the flies, and people are experiencing this, were the people going to be ready for what I think is one of the most important of the plagues is number 10, right?
Yeah.
To put blood on their doorposts if they had not experienced watching these plagues play out. And we see that the children of Israel are already going to murmur and not be so happy about being in the wilderness and leaving their slavery life and living on manna.
You'd think that would be enough in and of itself just to leave their life of slavery, but we'll see it's not.
I just wonder if in God's mercy as well as he was trying to prepare the hearts of the people, because all of a sudden you've lived through the blood, the frogs, the lice, the flies, the livestock, right? The boils and the hail, to the point where it's like, okay, well, maybe this isn't Disneyland.
So motivating Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but also motivating the Israelites to
prepare to leave. And I
like that.
And I would like to think that the pandemic the last 2 years has happened on a global scale, but it has for sure not transpired in each individual home in the same way.
Right.
There's some of our brothers and sisters in Zimbabwe that were much more worried about getting food than they were about worrying about the pandemic. And I think as we read this plague is happening, the chaos is happening around. But what is the lesson intended for each of us individually? I think even when there's a global experience, was it God's way of getting hearts and minds prepared in a way that maybe in his mercy, we've said before on the show, was actually loving?
Yeah.
Because he didn't want there to be an attachment to this place anymore.
I mean, it has to be framed in love. God is love. I mean, whether we see it or not, love has to be at the center of it. Now, you can frame it any way you want, but love has to be part of that frame, right? Like, it has to be the frame.
Yeah, but is the prophet going to be able to stand up and ask us to say, hey, can you put blood on your doorposts?
Right.
And we're going to be like, wait, really? I don't understand how that's going to protect my children.
Yeah.
How is that one simple act going to protect my children? If maybe I've had 9 other experiences where I can recall where God, through his prophet, was preparing my heart. I just wonder if, that for all of us, we can look in the last 2 years and see where maybe we've had a reframe in our own personal lives because of this pandemic and this experience that I would call kind of a plague, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In more ways than one,
Right.
I'd say, is what it's done to us kind of socially as well.
Right.
Yeah, so many levels.
Should we jump to Passover and dive
let's
into
do it.
that? Plagues,
Please.
punishment, promotion, and Passovers.
Yeah.
I have to throw in an alliteration
Wow,
there, right?
that's quite, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's great.
So
Great alliteration.
Elder Gong said, Passover remembers the deliverance of the children of Israel from 400 years of bondage. The book of Exodus relates how this deliverance came after the plagues we've just talked about: frogs, lice, flies, and the death of cattle, boils, blains, hail, and fire, locusts, and thick darkness. The final plague threatened the death of the firstborn in the land, but not in the house of Israel. If those households put the blood of an unblemished firstling lamb on the lintels of their doors. And I think about how we all can kind of ask where maybe God is asking us to take the atonement of Christ actually into the doorposts of our homes so that we're protected. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I just love the symbolism, right? Just the doorway in and out of my home is Jesus. I think of doorway in and out of my heart. I think of that painting of Jesus knocking at the door, right? Which is symbolically sort of the door of our soul, and we've got to let him in. But yeah, that's just the key to surviving these plagues is, surprise, Jesus, right?
Yeah. We have one of those I won't say the Hebrew word correctly, where it holds the scriptures and it's on the doorpost. And so every time we go into the garage,
Mezuzah.
the mezuzah, is that
right?
how you say it? I didn't want to say it wrong.
I did. I went out on a limb.
Thanks for being courageous.
Yeah.
But we just had some teenagers over on Sunday and they were like, wait, Mama Condi, what is this? And so I was able to say, like, are you holding the scriptures close to you? And it's a reminder every time I go get in my car every day, like, how close are the scriptures, which are one way in which we can bring the atonement. So Exodus 9, plagues 2 through 7 are there, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about reframing how all of the plagues upon thine heart, upon thy servants, and upon thy people, that thou mayest know there is none like me in all the earth. So, like, are you seeing God in all of the plagues that are happening? And then plagues 8 through 9, I think, are in Exodus 10. The final plague, really, do you have any thoughts you want to talk about this in detail? Because I think it's such a beautiful connection to Christ, right?
Yeah, I love how the blood on the doorpost spares us from that final plague and sort of grants life in the very process and protection, just like the Savior does in our daily lives. As far as the Egyptians losing the firstborn of their families, lots of different theories on this again. The one that stood out to me this time through was that maybe the Egyptians, in their desperation to make these things stop, in order to placate their gods, sacrificed, or it was dictated by their leaders to sacrifice the firstborn of every household
It's a
to
really
placate the
interesting
gods,
insight.
to make it stop. And when that didn't work, you can imagine even more the anger and resentment toward the children of Israel, whom they ascribed all this to.
Right.
And so I don't know the origins of what really happened there. Again, we're dealing with a very old narrative with lots of details missing, but anyway, that one stood out to me this time as a plausible scenario.
So in a few weeks, April 15th is when Passover officially begins for this year. And I think it's a great opportunity for your family. If you haven't done a Passover
We've done
dinner,
Passover dinners before.
You can switch things up a little so that some of the parts of it are maybe more palatable for your children.
Good word.
The church,
Literally.
the church can't Come Follow Me manual has a great chart of where the lamb, the blood on the doorpost, the eating the lamb, and the bitter herbs, how symbolically that relates. But Passover for this year is April 15th through the 23rd. And I think what a great opportunity to talk about some of the symbolism and how Elder Waddell? He was my stake president, so I almost called him President Waddell. But is he in the presiding bishopric? Bishop Waddell, whatever you are, Bishop Waddell, you were my stake president. That the sacrifice and the blood, he said this, alone would not have been sufficient to obtain the promised blessing without the application of the blood to the doorpost. The sacrifice would have been in vain. And so what can we do to use our agency to act to apply the atonement into our lives? And I think what a great example the children of Israel are to us of where they, in a lot of trauma, chose to take action. And I love President Waddell, Bishop Waddell, whatever your title is currently, that reminder of that power can't function in my life if I'm not going to take action.
I think that's a great segue to Exodus 13 and being harnessed. What do you think about that?
So verse 18, right?
Yeah, I love it.
But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt. And I just think, what a great experience for us. The sacrament really is our kind of Passover experience on a weekly basis. And I can feel it, not General Conference week or State Conference weekend, but if I go beyond that, I can feel that I'm not harnessed.
Yeah.
Have you had experiences there where you're feeling that harnessing?
So many. And I'll just say this quickly, that ordinance, the sacrament ordinance, more and more in my life becomes the moment in the week where I get harnessed. I harness up with the Lord for the rest of that week, you know what I mean? And so I just love the ordinance and I love the imagery. I think of a harness and how I just feel protected when I'm rappelling or whatever. And you can just, I remember rappelling with one of my boys and he was so scared. We were side by side. He was younger and he was shaking on the side of this cliff. And I said, trust your gear, buddy. Trust your gear, And eventually he'd go down. He couldn't say his R's at the time, and he'd be like, Dad, trust your gear. Trust your gear. I'm like, you're doing great, buddy. And so maybe a good application of being harnessed with the Lord, trust your gear this week and know that He's got you.
I wasn't thinking of harnessing for rappelling. I was thinking for a Disneyland ride, but
Hey,
that's why we're both hosting this show.
That could be equally scary.
Right? Like the roller coaster of life. And I definitely think like just Spirit was prompting for those that see the sacrament as only a time to reflect on everything they did wrong. I think when I've switched the last few years in rejoicing in how God, I look back on the week and think, oh my, He was with me and I was safe with Him and I trusted that gear. So I love that experience that you just shared. Our invitation for you this week is maybe as you prepare for a general conference, where are the warnings? Where's the counsel that's coming to you from God through His apostles and prophets and current church leadership that we're going to hear this weekend, or maybe on the replay, maybe when you reread talks? We invite you to see where those warnings are very personal for you or for your family. And we hope that you will join us again next week for another episode of Real Talk, Come Follow Me.
Do you like Real Talk, Come Follow Me?
Then like and subscribe.